Mhm. Awesome. Thanks so much, B. Uh, all right. Thank you, everybody, for gathering here. Today, we are going to be talking about agentic AI. And sometimes I don't even know what that means. I feel like, wait, aren't all AI kind of semi-autonomous? Isn't that what means to be an agent? I feel like the internet doesn't really know what agents are anymore because it's like the language gets confused. But anyways, we're here to talk about AI agents. So I think of them as, you know, AI systems that are acting at least somewhat autonomously, capable of making their own decisions, taking actions in the world, like operating web pages, and sometimes even pursuing goals on behalf of users, i.e., people, right? But also potentially other agents. So these systems are pretty important, and they're becoming more and more important. We're building more and more companies are building and releasing different kinds of agentic workflows, and that's changing and shaping how people, access information, coordinate with one another, something I care a lot about, and interact with various institutions of all kinds. But as these agent systems become more powerful, more widely used, more economically important, there's a set of questions like, who are they actually serving? What are the sort of rail guards, rail lines, rail something, guardrails, guardrails. What are the guardrails for these things? Who controls them? How are they governed? And what happens when these agents become uh, the new interfaces to public services, to civic participation, or to various kinds of markets, uh, or when they're become performant actors, as many agents already are within kind of financial markets. So right now, most agentic development happens behind closed doors, and some of us have been behind those closed doors. Thank you for joining us here. So within tech companies, and these are, agents are often optimized for monetization. There's like, not super clear transparency there. And that's real risk, right? Because agentic AI, if we follow that route, could lead to deepening existing power asymmetries, in which private actors at the expense of the public. So the goal for this conversation is, there's different varieties of, I think we could approach it, is what should a public AI strategy for agents look like? That might be a strategy that is kind of two different questions of like, what for countries, like what should an agent strategy look like? How should countries invest in infrastructure? But also a question for ourselves as a community is like, what should agent, how should we be approaching this sort of agent level question? A lot of the work we've been sort of doing, and at least for me, has been really focused on things like large language models, pre-training, a little bit of post-training, right? And this is a whole different kind of architecture that, obviously is built on top of that stack, but requires, I think, a different approach and a different set of questions. So let's just dig into that question a little bit. Or to kind of open it up. So concretely, what kind of infrastructure, standards, or institutions do we need to ensure that these agentic systems actually serve the public interest? How do we make space? And this is something that I'm particularly interested in, and we ideated this in kind of the original versions of the libraries project. How do we make space for public agents? So agents that represent specific communities, serve public missions, or perhaps advance democratic values. So this is still very much an open field. I think we have many, many different questions. But I've asked some people to join us here that have been thinking about this for quite a while. I'll just call out Dan, Nick Garcia, Catherine, who I believe is working on a report on law and agents right now, and many others who have been thinking about these things very deeply. And I'm really glad they're here to join us for this conversation. Okay, so with that, I want to open it up. And if it's not too much, I would love to call on Dan, Nick, and or Catherine. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's not to say have you need to come in and present an answer, but I would love if you could just share a little bit more about your work, where you're coming from, and maybe any provocations or wisdom that you've gleaned that can help us kind of, start this conversation. Can I see Dan muting? I'll pass it to you.
Sure. This is probably the only part where I'm slightly useful. So, and if you can't hear me through the mask, I apologize. I'm sick and desperately trying not to get my partner sick as well. Um, I think it's useful to start off with the definition of an agent, right? So, in many of these cases, if you think about an agent, the line is getting blurred, but typically the definition we go by is essentially there's some degree of autonomy. So you have to give the agent some autonomy to do some parts of a task for you in which you have no explicit control. In few shot conversations you would have with a chatbot, you're basically waiting for a reply to your immediate response, asking it to generate a poem, asking it to write a funny joke, or trying to provoke the LLM to kind of break its chains and become sentient, whatever your kind of flavor or habit might be. Um, but then with agents, you have this kind of loop of basically planning, acting, and then sort of reasoning that you kind of go through until it does something that's basically a very complicated task that you leave it to autonomously do and accomplish this iterative loop essentially. So if you ask it to, let's say, write an email and send it out, for example, that would be agentic because you're trusting the agent to essentially access your email client, find the right person, compose content, potentially subject to your final approval and then write and send that email out. So that's how I would think about sort of defining or trying to define in these shifting sands what agentic capabilities of an agent is. Secondly, I think it's also useful to talk about the taxonomy of agents. So when most people think about agents nowadays, they think about an agent that can basically surf the web or do tasks for you on the web, book your dinner reservations, book airline tickets, so on and so forth. But and honestly, like agents kind of span a larger place than just that, right? So when people think about agents nowadays, they think about agents as digital AI assistants, so computer use agents more formally, or CUA. In these cases, these computer use agents can basically access your computer, do things for you, calculate things on spreadsheets for you, write emails for you, browse the web, and pick basically, let's say, pick a restaurant for you, book tickets at your favorite movies. Anything you would do on a computer, the agent would do for you. So that's one type of agent. There are two other types of agents that I feel like receive less attention, but are still quite agentic and quite important. One is probably in the physical AI space. So if you think about robotics or Proteus or the fleet of robots that, for example, Amazon deploys, right? Or think about the different edges on device, where essentially you have small models that you want to place on there that can basically autonomously accomplish tasks in that loop as well. The third and final space that I would sort of think about bringing up in the agentic taxonomy is also in what I would probably call social sciences. So think about AI not necessarily trained into the form of large language or large multimodal models that are capable of navigating the world as robots, or even those that are capable of navigating the web or your own computers, but rather agents that are very, very human realistic. So think of them as kind of human simicula, or think of them as digital twins, right? The reason why this gets neglected a lot is because obviously there's not immediate utility in the whole sort of investment thesis of trying to invest in AI to do things and automate or make things autonomous or to automate things. But they are important. A lot of social scientists, healthcare professionals, etc., they basically want to develop very human realistic agents, LLMs or large multimodal models that are very human realistic in the sense in how they emote and their population statistics and how they behave, so on and so forth, for purposes of experimentation. So if you want to run a large scale experiment that would be otherwise unethical on real humans, social science experiments, for example, these agents would be a stand-in for those. For social media companies that need to run A/B tests to test features but don't have enough people to do a cold start, they rely on these agents potentially as well. For people who have, let's say, for people who are running clinical trials, for people who don't have enough people that they can enroll into a control group or treatment group because of the rarity of the condition that's being treated, so on and so forth. These generative models serve as powerful kind of backstops as well. So I'll probably just start off there and kind of stop babbling by saying like that's how I think about agents in the current landscape nowadays and where that taxonomy stands, at least for me as someone who works on this stuff.
That's super interesting. I honestly never thought of the human simulation, like you're talking about like the Concordias type stuff.
Yeah, exactly. The Concordia type stuff, where basically you want to come up with an agentic persona that, obviously there are consequences to everything, including negative consequences, such as there are problems that you might see come up socially with the use of reliance on these LMs personas for people who have rely too much on these aspects, right? Treating these LM agents as real people that then delve into more serious issues, psychosis on the most extreme end, mild disillusionment on the less extreme, more subtle end. So they're not without their problems also.
Very interesting. Um, well, I have lots of questions already, but instead of, uh, I would love to pass it to Nick and Catherine, if you guys are up for it, and then we'll open up for general conversation and have pose questions then. Um, Nick?
Hello, everyone. I have just arrived home, so I'm going to switch Zooms in a minute, but I'll do my introduction here, and then we'll switch over. So I'm Nick Garcia, Senior Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge. I think this is a great follow-up to what David was just saying in terms of that I am approaching this from a legal perspective. I bring a background as a lawyer and as an ethicist into thinking about what an agent is. And so we have a set of definitions for what agents are in the kind of computing context and how people are thinking about designing agentic systems. But we also have a bunch of legal questions that Josh was teeing up at the beginning in terms of what systems, like how they should be serving the public and how we think about them in our world. It's going to be a very new and interesting thing when we have a bunch of different AI systems, whether they're computer use agents or simulacra or more autonomous robots, suddenly being dispersed into everyday life. And it raises questions of who is in control of the.
Oh no. Who is in
Who
control?
is in control? They're really in control now. I think the NSA just cut off Nick.
Oh no.
Okay.
We heard you up to who is in control, and then it got out.
Oh, that's wild. Okay. Maybe we switched over to my Wi-Fi for a second. Okay, so who is in control? Who is responsible? Who is accountable for when things go wrong with these systems? And what is the overlap of those things? So when I think about agents, a frame or a lens that I would introduce into the conversation here is that agents are, from a legal perspective, traditionally someone who is acting on behalf of another. And with that comes a certain set of legal responsibilities and doctrines and duties related to one's accountability or responsibility as an agent. It's not clear yet how we are going to apply those doctrines or if we are going to apply them to AI agents. But I think that this is a fruitful area to think about in terms of making some affirmative decisions here early on in deciding what the liability and legal rules should be around AI agents, because that will shape in many ways the way that we do deployment of these things. I have more to say to that, but I'll leave it there, I think, as a good introduction and provocation, and we can come back and talk about some of the other dimensions of why liability models and legal rules are important.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. Catherine.
I assume it's me, this Catherine.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, completely unrehearsed, but I actually have something to add, which is fun. I'm thinking about AI agents from a risk management perspective. So also certainly a legal perspective, but not sort of like exposed after deployment, but basically prior to it. Who are the different parties that are responsible for checking that we don't deploy agents that have certain shortcomings that will then potentially lead to liability issues. So the focus currently is to analyze the applicability of the EU AI Act in its various provisions to figure out certain issues there, the appropriateness of the definitions, but also the risk mitigation strategies around it, because you could probably plausibly make the case that when the AI Act was drafted, agentic systems weren't at the forefront of their minds. In 2021 in particular, it wasn't even really general purpose AI models. They were sort of added on later. So I'm looking specifically at systemic risks and how that's defined, and how particularly like very strongly autonomous AI can exacerbate those risks and which ones are not covered. So there are there are certain sort of like legal constraints around what the AI Act is even able to do, just given the founding treaties of the Union. So if you're concerned about mass job loss and the trickle-down effects on the economy and social systems, that's not a risk that is even addressed under the AI Act. And so I'm sort of like trying to make that a little bit more comprehensive for people of what you can expect from that particular ex ante regulation mechanism. And then also grappling with the distinction along the value chain, right? When you have the general purpose AI model developer, then you have a distinct entity under the AI Act, the system developer. What's the difference between a model and a system in the first place? Very tricky question, surprisingly. And then you have the system deployer, who is actually supposed to discharge oversight, for example. And then sort of my favorite issue to grapple with right now are indeed the oversight provisions, because under like a very stringent reading, you could make the case that with the requirements under the AI Act, the oversight provisions would essentially prevent compliant deployment, because at least with very advanced general purpose AI model capabilities, such as opaque reasoning or latent reasoning or situational awareness, when systems or models, wherever you want to draw the line, are actually able to comprehend when they're being monitored and then can modify their behavior. If that's the case, then you might not be able to discharge those oversight obligations, and so you actually can't do it in compliance with those with these provisions. And so it's like, from a policy perspective, then really interesting what that means, if that was intended, what can be done about it. So yeah, these are the sort of questions I'm grappling with.
Super interesting. A quick point of order before pass it to B's question. If you have any questions or if you have a comment, by the way, this is not intended to be a panel. This is an open discussion. So please come in and feel free to, do the whole long question thing that is actually a comment, but just make the comment. But if you want to join in, please raise your hand on Zoom. And if you want to join in because there's a really relevant comment that's going to lose relevance, just also raise your hand in Zoom, but also raise 2 fingers, and I will make sure you get called on sort of immediately. Pass it. And lastly, I will turn off the recording in around 10 minutes, just to give people a taste of the conversation, and the remainder of the call will be more private Chatham House rule. Pass it to B.
Thanks, Josh. And yes, we always love to have the spicy part of the conversation as well. I'm B. Cavello. I lead the emerging tech team at Aspen Digital, a program of the Aspen Institute. And what Catherine said just now really stood out to me, because it reminded me of, I want to say that it was Audi or maybe Volkswagen. They got in trouble for basically they had a detection system in their cars when they were doing emissions testing that they would perform differently when they were under testing versus like when you were just driving your car. So like this isn't even something that necessarily requires like super intelligent agents, right? It requires a degree of sensing capability and maybe some less scrupulous business practices. I think that I'm coming at this from the perspective of being someone who, while I'm working in the kind of outside of government policy space right now, my last role was working in Congress in the US Senate. And one of the things that really stood out to me around any type of policies that we try to develop around tech terms, specifically AI terms, is that it's really hard to carve in what you want and carve out what you want. So we're actually working with a bunch of brilliant folks, Nick Garcia included, on an initiative called Defining Technologies of Our Time, around digging into how we define these terms in legislative text. And one of the things that stood out to me, and I was really grateful for Dan's kind of layout of the frame of what agents are, because it's a big debate, is that it seems like agents in particular are going to be a really, really tough one. You know, a classic thing that we run into with any kind of AI policy is the idea that like, oh, well, this covers a calculator, or this covers, spam filtering, or this covers spreadsheets. And some of the times I'm like, yes, it does. It should. Like if we're using them in that way. But agents in particular, I feel like are one of these really wiggly woggly terms where it's really hard to carve in and out what we want. And I might argue the approach we took on the Algorithmic Accountability Act is like, maybe that's good. Like maybe there's actually a bunch of kind of agentic systems that we're already leaning into, or a bunch of automated systems we're already leaning into that should have more oversight than they presently do today. But I'm curious how you all think about when you're thinking about agents and our approach for public AI. I think that there's the public AI approach around agents that is focused on policies, right? Focused on these legal carve outs. There's, I think, a public AI strategy that is around um, uh, creating the space for people to build, right? What is it, given all these complexities that exist around agents, how do we make it easier for the public to build and deploy agents of their own, such that they aren't, running into maybe as many of these conflicts of interest? And then I think there's also a question of public AI from the perspective of like, to Catherine's point about some of these larger systemic risks, like, are there spaces where we just want to say no, right? Are agents a foregone conclusion? Do we already have agents today? And like where are the spaces? I know I get squicked out whenever there's one of those companies saying like, do your UX testing without any people. Where are there spaces that we want to draw lines? So I'm curious, as you all are thinking about this, certainly Dan, Nick, and Catherine, but also everybody else on this call, when we're thinking about public AI, the public AI movement and its engagement with the topic of agentic AI, what are the things that what does that mean for public AI, and like where should our focus be?
I have a quick comment on that. So one thing I didn't mention, but that I've also been thinking about is precisely what you mentioned, the responsibility or opportunity of everybody else to sort of like get in, build their own agents, or build sort of like compatible infrastructure so that agents can interact with whatever products, websites, or whatever you have that you want the agent to interact with, and what restrictions or affordances you can sort of like build into it from your perspective, although you're by no means the model or the system developer yourself. And it's going to be very interesting to see whether we can encourage or perhaps enforce in some way cooperation between those entities that build these models and then infrastructure providers of the people out there that are essentially providing the services, products, or what have you that agents are supposed to interact with. So taking responsibility on that front, I think, is a really interesting one to think about, where traditional is not fair, but the currently drafted AI regulation has no handle on, because they are very specifically focused on the entities that are developing AI models. So we have to think about, I don't know, telecommunication laws, or I guess we have this already in the autonomous vehicle space, where there is regulation that has something to do with AI when it comes to cars. But yeah, so much more to think about than simply AI targeted regulation or sort of like initiatives. So yeah, really good point.
So I think in trying to put a public AI lens on some of these questions, I'm gonna bring in two things. One is the infrastructure question, and then the other is like the nature or definitions of the publics that we're interested in as it relates to agents. So on the infrastructure point, I think we are still in a moment with AI and with the development of the ecosystem where it's not clear yet what scale compute for certain applications is necessary. So when it comes to something like agents, which are maybe meant especially to be operating for or on behalf of individuals, or like Dan was saying earlier, that if you're thinking about them in the context of like the robotics or on-device space, it may be the sense that like in those contexts, we want the compute to be more out towards the edge, as we would say, in the ecosystem, right? You want the compute to like live with the people. So you want like maybe users or consumers to have access to compute to run their own agents. Or obviously, if you're talking about robots or on-device type stuff, they're going to be running on their own kind of hardware as well. So that is like a very public vision that you could think about. And what would the role then of the public of the public AI ecosystem being in trying to make sure that you have broadly distributed, kind of compute access in that way. You could imagine it at different scales as well, that like if agents are something that are really valuable, but they really require a ton of great inference power in order to be valuable, where they have to run at a super big data center, that's where you think about maybe public resources for like in order to give people access to that kind of public compute infrastructure. And I think you can also think then at middle layers about like if there are particular agents that we care about, and Josh alluded to this in his comments before, that are maybe running on behalf of communities or groups of people, or you want to run them for individuals, but they require a little bit more scale than the things that could exist at the edge. That's where maybe community models of distributed compute infrastructure could happen, like through nodes that like live in communities, perhaps through libraries or universities or other kinds of traditional digital anchor institutions. So I think one way to think about the public AI lens on this is thinking about where agents are going to live, who we want to be running them or who might be running them, and for what purposes, and then thinking about what is the infrastructures that we need to support those visions of having that. The other thing is related so much to what a little bit of what Catherine was just talking about, and relates to the kind of question that Bea brought up in terms of where do we want to prohibit in spaces, and how do we think about agents in our various spaces. And so this maybe in some sense has to do with definitions of public, but I think another very essential component that's going to come in here is going to be thinking about identity solutions, both for people and for bots. Proof of humanness is going to maybe become very important if you want to be excluding AI agents from certain kinds of spaces or functions, or including only people in those places, or picking specific people from community. Having privacy protecting forms of digital identity solution will be really important there.
Dan.
So it's quite complicated. So from my perspective, both as a former policymaker, but as someone now who's also working on this technically, I feel like a lot of this sort of work when it comes to where agents lie, how to regulate them in the public domain and such, is a very difficult question. Just simply because the use cases are so scattered, and also because some of the use cases are just not fully realized yet. In some cases, the use cases are well understood by those in the kind of places that are using these already. But sometimes there's also this sort of disconnect between what the public sector think these agents are, where they're being used versus how they're actually being used now. This is one example. There's some regulation proposed by folks in different forums about tracking agent uses, for example. And when they're doing this, they're kind of implicitly assuming computer use agents, right? So how they access the web, how they scrape data, how they sort of ping different services, how they collect knowledge from places they may not have permissions to do so, so on and so forth. The problem is these actions are very difficult to track, right? It's almost impossible, if not very difficult right now to know, oh, it's this LLM model that's Claude 4.1 paired up with a visual grounder that's basically COACT or GTA 1 that is currently pinging my website, getting this data when it shouldn't be, right? When my policy forbids it, or US national policy or regulation has allowed us to basically say no to these sorts of things and try to limit them at a certain rate. So the implementation, I think, is going to be very difficult. And understanding these use cases, there is a bit of a disconnect between the public arena and what's actually going on the ground floor, so to speak. But I think this is a common theme that plagues all regulations, right? The second thing I'll say is that the US government has never really been very good at kind of fostering innovation in a single hand-picked strategy or fashion. It's always been better at, not maybe in recent days, but maybe in decades past, at infrastructure, right? But then the key question that begs is essentially, well, what kind of infrastructure is justifiable enough for the private sector to pick up the cost, so that individual communities and developers, not just the private sector companies themselves, the big AI labs themselves, but also individual users or people, right? The Vox Populi, so to speak, also see value in it. When it comes to having diversity of training your own agents and putting them out there, I unfortunately don't think the US government is going to be the one that's playing that role. We already see a lot of companies, both big and small, already doing these sorts of things where they make it very easy for people to sort of just pick their own agent, train their own agent, and test and deploy their own agent. There are attempts with things like MCP, but then again, the adoption of MCP runs into that old question of who picks up the tab, who picks up the cost, who makes it viable enough and incentive compatible enough for people to sort of play out and do, right? So I think that, and not to mention MCP is full of security holes, which are a nightmare for most companies as well, right? So I think the key thing to understand here is there a specific use case that can be held up as a model of success for other developments down the road? Oh, sorry, I just saw your question, B. MCP is basically this sort of model context protocol. It was proposed by Anthropic in, I want to say, late 2024. And it was trying to standardize the way kind of like these different LLMs kind of talk to sites, integrating shared data with external tools, systems, and data sources. And it was meant to be like a communication protocol similar to, or inspired probably from like TCP/IP, which is sort of the basis for networking traffic, internet communication, so on and so forth, back all the way into the 80s, 90s, like good old computer science stuff, essentially. But the MCP was more adapted to the stochasticity and the randomness that these LLMs have, especially when they call different tools or systems across a patchwork of places on the internet, for example. So hopefully that helps a little bit to clarify that. So I think having a specific use case, like a very good golden use case, a very specific one that demonstrates how we have this awareness to apply to a specific problem and sort of solve that is better than sort of a very overreaching kind of regulation, because that in itself, in its generality, in some sense, at least from my point of view, in terms of how I see these things being practiced, is already self-defeating to some extent, if that makes sense.
Really quick follow-up then. Could you give us one potential example, just speculate, of a use case, of such a golden use case that would justify kind of like this kind of public sector support or infrastructure?
Yeah, so let's say, for example, and this is very difficult. So if you think about, I guess the easiest thing to do is the places, or in the sort of taxonomy I defined earlier, is kind of in the third category of basically thinking of agents as social simulant or simulated people or simulated or some sort of simicula, right? Because in those cases, ideally the experimenters have full control and transparency into the systems that are being played, right? So if I come up with a model, for example, for a clinical trial, that I want to come up with a model that tries to represent features of some underrepresented cohort I'm using for drug testing, right? To make sure my A/B tests work out well, or to make sure my clinical tests work out well when it comes to the statistical significance and power of such tests, so that I can then proceed forward to say, okay, this therapy or this drug or this treatment is worth further investigation, right? So on and so forth, before submitting to the FDA, so on and so forth. In those cases, I know full well what models I'll be using. I know full well what data I'll be training on. I know full well what the existing set of laws and regulations in my country or whatever domicile or jurisdiction I'm in are when it pertains to, like, for example, in the United States, HIPAA, right? Or when it comes to data privacy laws, for example, in Germany or other places. I know I have that strong contextual backing in how things like data are already treated. I have full transparency and control into my models. I have full transparency and control into my models and their workflows. And in those cases, it's much easier to specify, okay, when you define agents, this is what you can and can't do. They can't make up more than 10% of the cohort you're trying to test with your drugs or therapies, right? Because if you're testing drugs and therapies with 100% of agents, even if your results say, oh, this drug has cured cancer, I'm probably not going to buy it, right? There are also a ton of other safety and ethical concerns there as well. So in those cases, that is fairly clear, at least to me, through my personal bias. Of course, lack of awareness of other things notwithstanding. Um, but when it comes to things like, for example, financial markets, when you're forbidding the use or trying to control, modify, or limit the use of agents in financial markets when it comes to automated trading, good luck, because there's no way for us to understand or track, see when that's going to happen. The letter of the law says one thing, the spirit of the law can be interpreted in an entirely different way, as we've seen throughout the years. So that's kind of my main concern, right? And that's how I see it, as if the US doesn't already have existing strong legal backing, implementations, or infrastructure to be able to do this, proposing a law or regulation that does it without it will surely not really be very effective.
Super interesting. And I'll have to share some of the CERN for collective intelligence conversations with you, because it's very related to that kind of human simulacra stuff. Actually, some of it is with Joel from Concordia. Let me take this opportunity to, first off, we're noting at the hour, I know some people have to jump. So please join me and unmute yourself. I will count down to 3 and I would invite everybody to join me in a raucous round of applause for all our, I guess, I didn't warn them this was going to happen, but effectively kind of like our publication sort of providers, and for everybody here for joining us for this so far excellent discussion. And then I will turn off the recording. So 3, 2, 1.
Clap, 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 clap,
Thank you
clap,
all very
clap,
much.
clap, clap, clap.
All right. We'll turn off the recording.